Welcome to everyone, and our apology for the episode 1 of our talk that some technical problem happened. We couldn't control it. Anyway, we managed in our episode 1 with Professor Greg Fry to finish talking about the New Pacific diplomacy and his work on that particular book with his students and other academic associates. Now we will continue to his one of his main books, which is Framing the Islands. Framing the Islands. It's a very controversial book. When I read some of it, almost finished, and I'm so glad to have Greg here to talk straight about this production of him and its complexity and conflicting nature. With the title itself, it says Framing the Islands. and you can pick it there, either framing it in a good sense or framing it in a bad sense. But Greg, I would like to read something that I would like you to mention also about, and I'm sure you're going to mention it, but I was, and I'm interested on the term. In this book, you discuss a variety of issues since the 18th, 19th century, some reflection to those centuries on framing the islands. But there is a term here, before you start talking, to give an overview about the book, is it's a blue Pacific continent. Okay. And it says here that you were talking about the hegemonic impositions from the outside, and this paragraph on the cover, it says that, for example, I'll just quickly, in the strong commitment to the blue Pacific continent, framing as a guiding ideology for the policy work of the Pacific Islands Forum in the face of pressures to become part of Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy. But I'll leave it there. I'll just, I was very impressed by that. So, but I'll pass on to you to to start talking about framing the islands.
Thank you, Siwa. Well, as you quite rightly said, it could be taken as framing in a good sense or a bad sense.
Yes.
And so we often think of framing as we frame a picture, and we concentrate on what's inside the picture and try and understand it. Other times we frame people in order to make them do things that we want them to do, and it's not something they want to do. So there are two different senses of the term framing. So what I was trying to do in this book is look back at right from the beginning of when outsiders started to say there was something called the Pacific, this idea of the Pacific.
Yes.
Because for the people living there, they were getting on with their lives in Tonga or Samoa or in their own village, and they weren't thinking, oh, I belong to the Pacific. Although they might have many long voyages and so on, they wouldn't necessarily understand this concept of region. But for the outsiders, from the start, they wanted to bring order to their scientific knowledge. So they created a frame around the Pacific.
That's right.
Around all these islands, and said, inside these islands, we're going to make some generalizations. So it becomes a very powerful thing. It's not just a mapping.
Yeah.
It actually starts to affect how people live, because those outside groups are saying, oh, inside this group now are Pacific Islanders. They're all Pacific Islanders.
Yes.
And they then make generalizations about that group.
Yeah.
They're all child races.
Yeah.
Or they're all people who are states that are in an arc of crisis.
Yes.
Or they're all people that are dying out. These assumptions that are made from big pictures from the European world affect the policy that affects people living in the Pacific.
Certainly, indeed.
So these are framings of the Pacific that can actually start to be framings in a different sense, in a bad sense. But at the same time, once independence comes in the Pacific Island leaders started to frame the Pacific as well. They started to say, well, wait a sec, we've got a different frame. When we look at the picture, we see something different inside, and we want to see a self-determining Pacific. We want to see something that is maybe going against your idea of a Cold War security idea or a neoliberal economics idea.
That's right.
Whatever you're trying to impose on us as a regional frame, we need to contest that and think about it.
Yeah.
So what I did was in this book is to set up each chapter around a contest of ideas at different stages of the history, to see what different groups were saying should be within the frame, how it should be framed, the idea of the Pacific.
Yes.
What should happen to Pacific Islanders and as a group. And it's a long contest that's occurred over in all the different fields: economics, ecology, security, development. And it's involved NGOs, it's involved churches,
Yes, that's right.
It's involved the state,
Yes.
it's involved the great powers, it's involved the international agencies like the UN.
Yeah.
So they all have a view about what should happen to the Pacific. There's a World Bank Pacific report.
Yeah.
There's a United Nations Development Program
That's right.
report. There's an Amnesty Pacific report.
Yeah.
There's a report from Worldwide Fund for Nature and for the Greenpeace.
Yeah.
So each group has their view about what's happening in the Pacific, what should happen to the Pacific.
Yeah.
So these are framings. So it's looking at the contests over these different ideas and different positions over time.
Yeah.
So it's looking at who wins, in a sense, these contests at each point.
Yes.
And so in the end, I'm really asking, who is the Pacific for? The idea of the Pacific,
That's
this
right.
idea of region, is it for the outsiders or for the insiders, the people who live there?
Yeah.
Do they get framed in the end in the bad way, or is it a good way?
Yeah.
So can it work for them as well?
Yeah.
So that's how it connects to the discussion we had last time about the New Pacific Diplomacy, because that's the kind of current framing that's going on now with the Pacific leaders saying, wait a sec, this is our frame, this is what we take to it, and we're confronting your frame which says that we should be like this. So it's it goes through that history. So it's become if we think about it historically in all parts of the world, the idea of regional framing is a very powerful thing.
It is.
If you think was brought up by Edward Said in relation to the Orient, Orientalism.
Yeah.
So you create something called the Orient,
Yes.
and then you take an ideology towards that Orient that you manage and control through colonialism.
Yeah.
And so it means that you can start to create how people start to see what an Oriental is. And then Orientals are learning in their education system that this is their self-image.
Certainly.
And this is what Apele Hau'ofa was trying to say in his essays. He was talking about this in the Pacific. He was saying that outsiders have a regional view of Pacific Islanders, and this then becomes a self-image.
Yes.
And so the idea that small states were powerless and vulnerable and always needy and not powerful and not having a strong history, it creates a disempowerment of the Pacific.
Yes.
And people take on the self-image, and he uses the word, for example, in Papua New Guinea, where colonial people would talk about all grown men there as boys.
Yes. Yeah.
And then the boys took on that view that, oh, I'm just a boy.
Yeah.
I look up to the man, so the adult. So it becomes self-fulfilling. The boy starts to act like a boy.
Yeah.
So he's saying, well, I need, as a teacher at the University of South Pacific, to give my students strength and empowerment and give them their history of a great Pacific of large ocean states and large ocean journeys and
That's right.
of all these achievements,
Yeah.
and to start to go to the world with that. So that was his framing of the islands. That was Apele Hau'ofa's framing.
That's right. Yeah.
So it's a very different framing to the framing that he was seeing coming from economics, security studies, and other social sciences, where people talked about small island states being particularly vulnerable, dependent,
That's right.
and powerless and unable to develop. So I think it's been a very important contest for the last 100 years in the Pacific between ideas about who the Pacific Islander is, who they can be, what agency they should have.
Yes.
And these have all been contested in that regional domain of knowledge as well as in the institutions.
Yeah. correct. There are countless issues there that have impressed and fascinated me, but I'll just share with you a few of them. Firstly, talking about the frame, are you referring or alluding to the frame and the picture inside are both in the process of change, or you change the frame and the picture is still there from colonization or decolonization or later years? Yeah.
So what I'm saying, I guess, is that yes, there are always Pacific Island societies there. There's a real Pacific that's there.
Okay.
But the people looking at the Pacific, when they look through their glasses, they're bringing to it particular ways of what they see.
Okay.
And often what they see is not what is there, but what's in their brain. And in their brain might be theories from Charles Darwin.
That's right.
Talking about the hierarchy of races. So they see, Polynesians are...
the pacifist view that you mentioned.
Or a view of Cold War security. They see regional security. Okay, regional security is stopping the Russians. Regional security is stopping China. Whereas for a Pacific Islander, it might be having the fishery stock conserved, or having food security, or having access to water. That might be security. So I think it's a good example to bring back to your earlier comments, is this Indo-Pacific versus the Blue Pacific.
Beautiful.
So this is a debate around two different framings of the Pacific in the security domain. So the outside world is going through a new Cold War with China, and particularly from Washington and Japan and Australia and India, and they're really promoting this idea of a region which is broader than the old Asia Pacific. It's the Indo-Pacific, to bring in India.
That's right.
And they're bringing a whole domain there, that, in a sense, to contain China, and to say that we have an idea about how this area should have a frame put around it, but also the character of the picture we see inside it. And the picture we see inside it is really... we only see things to do with this geopolitics, the really big picture thing. And that's our view of security. We're keeping out the Chinese. We don't have anything to do with them.
That's right.
We bring in the Western countries. And we have... maybe we have a military base in Papua New Guinea, an Australian-American base, and so on. But that's part of our view of what security is.
Security is, that's right.
That's Indo-Pacific, and it's become the main sort of term used when, say, a visiting American comes from Hawaii to the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. They'll be talking about this Indo-Pacific security. But the Pacific Island leaders have developed in response to this, but even before it, the idea of a blue Pacific continent. This comes out again of Apele Hau'ofa's work. And going right back to 1950, when the first conference of the South Pacific leaders, the first time all the leaders came together was in Suva in 1950. It was called the South Pacific Experiment.
That's right.
They all came together, and there were media people from all over the world trying to work out what's going on here. And the Christian Science Monitor sent an observer, and he wrote a long article about the blue Pacific continent. He said, we think of all these dots in the ocean, but in fact they're all part... What we're seeing today in this 1950 conference is the first step in reclaiming the Pacific, the blue Pacific continent. So the leaders today and the Forum Secretariat have latched on to that concept. And particularly the Samoan Prime Minister was quite big on this, but all the leaders have signed on to a Blue Pacific strategy. The Blue Pacific continent is used in all their UN talks now. They really talk, and the idea is to create the image of a frame that is solid, So underneath this ocean, they're all linked, and psychologically, identity, we're linked, and we are a continent. We should be seen together as a solid group. Now, the ideas in that frame for them are, first of all, a very broad view of security. So it includes climate change. It includes safety from disasters, natural disasters. It includes all sorts of food security and COVID, health issues, all these sorts of things.
Yeah.
So these are security. These are security of individuals, human security.
That's right.
So it's a different concept, a different framing of security, of regional security.
Yeah.
So when these two come together, these two groups, there's a kind of tension between these two ideas, these two framings of the Pacific.
That's right. Yeah.
About a contest about whose ideas should prevail in what frames policy, the policy that we take to the region.
That's right,
and affects people's lives.
Yes, yes.
So the Pacific, this is a good example of where the Pacific won the debate. They won the framing contest.
Yeah.
They all moved towards a conference in Nauru, and they created a treaty called the Boy Declaration.
The Boy,
and that's the security treaty for the region in this kind of post-colonial, post-Cold War world. In that treaty, Australia and New Zealand would have preferred a treaty that was much more in line with the Indo-Pacific.
With the
Indo-Pacific. But the Pacific leaders and the Pacific Forum Secretariat were pushing this idea of the Blue Pacific continent, and the idea of this broader notion of human security. So that treaty, the very first item talks about climate change being the absolute priority of security priority of the Pacific. And everyone signed on, including Australia and New Zealand. And we know Australia's position on this, so it's actually a big achievement for the Pacific to get Australia to sign that. And broader notions of human security. And so I regard that treaty as a kind of example of an outcome of a contest between two different framings of the Pacific. The leaders saying, no, we want it framed this way, and in the end realising that treaty captures that concept. So, and that influences outcomes because, for example, when Australia set up the Australia Pacific Security College as part of its new step up to the Pacific, the definition of what they do is the Boy Declaration. So if you go to their website at the ANU, you'll see that what they're concerned with for now is COVID. They're concerned about natural disasters. They're concerned about food security. So they're being influenced by that broader idea of security, broader framing that came from the Blue Pacific position.
Continue.
And so I think what the Pacific leaders have realised is that these kind of concepts capture people's imagination as an image of the Pacific. And the Blue Pacific, of course, captures the idea of, it's like the green economy. It captures the idea of a clean and controlled Pacific, conserved as well. So it has a kind of a double meaning there, not just a continent but also blue. That is enhancing the blue economy of the Pacific.
Craig, there was this colonization period, especially by the West. And then we have the decolonization, the Cold War came, as you partly talk about, and we moved to the Neo-Pacific diplomacy, and we are still moving towards. And here you talked about the interesting idea of the Pacific Blue continent or concept, and the confrontation in some way between the Pacific Islands, including New Zealand and Australia on one hand, and also just the islands themselves. Confrontation might not be the right word, but in contrast or comparison to the Indo-Washington approach. And as we look, throughout history, we have the British control mostly of the affairs in the Pacific before and other great powers. And then after the Second World War, we had the rise of America worldwide, and then they came in. And then what is your perceptions about America, apart from the Indo-Washington concept? America itself, British itself, New Zealand and Australia, in contrast to China in particular, with their quick and vast influence in the Pacific, particularly Samoa, Fiji, and Tonga. That's one question for you to comment on that. The other one is your perception about the individual interests of the islands, or between Melanesian, Micronesia, and Polynesian, how they are going, how they are cope with the idea of framing the islands in your book, and also with the new Pacific diplomacy. Do you, and the third question, do you think they are going in, seem to go in a totally different direction than what we have been experienced, or they are just going around within the
sub-regions, or
the islands,
the islands,
or they going around within the frame, the regional and the global frames of the big powers.
Oh, I see.
Just 3 points for you, or questions.
3 very big points. So the first one is really on geopolitics.
On geopolitics.
So and I think, as everyone knows, this is a time of a big change in terms of the rise of the United States in back into the Asia Pacific as China rises, and a lot of interest from Europe, from Britain, France, in coming back into the Pacific in a big way. Britain's reopening embassies and so on. Australia's opened embassies in every country now, so even small Niue, it's open there. So there's a lot more. Everyone's had a step-up program. They call it different things, but the Americans have got 3 different pieces of legislation before the Congress at the moment, some of them billions of dollars, to try and influence the Pacific. So they're very concerned about where things might go in relation to China. The Pacific leaders are less worried about that. They feel they can control China, so they want to have that Chinese investment and money like Australia and New Zealand did. So Australia was one of the I think it was the second biggest recipient of Chinese investment in the world. They had $100 billion come in the last 10 years. So the Pacific says, well, we'd like a bit of that as well. We'd like to have some roads and some infrastructure, some wharves. So they feel that as part of their framing of the Pacific, it's really about friends to all, but also managing all those great powers. That's right. But not saying just no to China and yes to America. So at the moment we have that Australia and New Zealand trying to put a foot in both camps. They want to be part of the Blue Pacific and part of the Indo-Pacific. Now the problem with that is I think the Blue Pacific for me is an emotional identifier. It's a bit you can belong to it if you embrace the ideas in a sincere way, I think. But I think Australia and New Zealand are being a bit cynical about signing on at the moment, or at least Australia is. But they've signed on, but I think they're not necessarily embracing the key ideas of climate change and really caring about what's happening to the Pacific with sea level rise and storm surge and so on. So they have a long way to go on embracing that and convincing the Pacific that they're really serious about it. So the geopolitics is going to get stronger and stronger, I think, as an influence on this high stakes sort of competition and tensions between groups. About we're seeing America playing quite hardball with the Micronesian states in terms of the renegotiation of associated statehood. We're seeing influence from Australia and America try to come in with a new military base in Manus Island. So these are serious moves. To come to your second point about the sub-regions. That's right. This is a very interesting development. So we had the development of the Melanesian Spearhead Group, which was a really dramatic development over a 20-year period. Melanesia worked as a lobby group within the broader forum for a long time, and then it officially became a Melanesian Spearhead Group and created a headquarters in Vila. And then once Fiji got suspended from the forum, they started to put a lot of effort into making the MSG a really vibrant organisation.
I see.
So they even expanded it further. So they've done things like a free trade area. They've done things like movement of professional people without visa.
That's right.
So things that the forum hasn't achieved, they're doing in Melanesia. Now, I guess the Polynesian group formed explicitly to kind of counter that, give a counterbalance to that power, and to also to look after Polynesian interests. So Polynesian is kind of a little bit different and interesting. It includes Hawaiians, Maori, Tokelau, so dependent territories, and people within settler states as well as independent states. So that's very interesting. But it's much
what
more
about
cultural.
Fiji? Where Fiji?
Fiji goes with the Melanesians at the moment. It's moved backwards and forwards.
That's right. That's why.
So it's located itself in the Melanesian spearhead group. So the Micronesians have, and the Polynesians are more cultural. So they're very much emphasising cultural heritage, the old Polynesian Federation, and so on. They haven't really got down to doing anything technical or economic or other things together like the others. Then the Micronesians meet as Micronesian leaders in the Micronesian executives. There's a president's summit and an executive summit. And interestingly, Kiribati and Nauru have only recently joined that. So up till then it was
joining the Micronesians.
Micronesians. Before that, they just stayed out of any grouping. And but they've now joined in as Micronesian in terms of their identity. So the Micronesian group tends to be more America-focused, Washington-focused.
That's right.
Tend to be more, and obviously they're very oceanic states, very climate change concerned, and so on. So they've come into the news lately because of this Micronesian split. So the Micronesian states are now saying that they're being there's a prejudice against them within the forum secretariat, that they didn't get their turn at leading the organisation. So they're moving out of the Pacific Islands Forum. Now this has a major implication for the Blue Pacific continent idea. Because suddenly a third of the continent is moving away.
That's right.
And splitting off.
There's a contradiction.
There's a contradiction. And they're also...
So we have the blue, the togetherness, and here there is a division.
Indeed. So it really goes right to the heart of the claim about unity, about the continent and about the ocean, because they are a third of the ocean. And also a lot of their leaders are the main people working on climate change and oceans, which are really the centre of the Blue Pacific strategy.
That's right,
So it really hits psychologically at the heart of the identity of this Blue Pacific framing, which has been so powerful. So what we have at the moment is 3 sub-regions. All of them talk about the need for a larger regionalism as well.
That's right,
a Pacific idea. But the Micronesians are saying we'll only be part of that if we get a fair go. Now it's up to the rest of the Pacific to work out a dialogue, a talanoa, that we can now work hard to resolve that is the tension, the bitterness, work out what they need to come back in, and to create some kava diplomacy, if you like, to bring everyone's emotions back together.
Calm the tension.
And bring people back.
I like that word, kava diplomacy.
It's quite active,
very appropriate
in the Pacific, and much more than the original kava countries. Now everybody uses it because they went to USB and so on. So the kava diplomacy, the Vanuatu, Solomons, everywhere, Papua New Guinea. So it's. I think it's a very crucial point for the future of the Pacific, and this current the power of the framing coming from the Pacific leaders. So they have to get this right. They have to bring these people back into the fold, and then they can be stronger.
That's right.
And these sub-regions could actually be make the whole house stronger, because if the sub-regions are happy, they can actually put forward their best person to be the head of the whole thing.
Indeed,
in turn.
That's right,
And it means everyone's happy, and you get the best candidate. And you have a role for the sub-regions also. Because they do have a role, because they are obviously doing things in the local area and culturally that are more attuned to those people.
Yes.
So that's really important.
Yeah.
So I think the sub-regionalism is a good thing that it's developed, but now it needs to be, each sub-region needs to be respected. And
That's right.
And I think the way to do that is to have this voting mechanism where they do it in the sub-region to put their best candidate forward, and that person's then assumed to be the new Secretary General of the Forum Secretariat. You trust that sub-region to produce the best candidate, and that person has their turn.
Yeah.
So after this current person, we have a Cook Islander there now. We need to obviously have a Micronesian, and move on that way, going around the three groups. Now, this is a method used all over the world, like in the UN Secretary General.
That's right. Yeah.
We go different regions. Europe, Africa.
Not to just confine to
just to Europeans. Or something.
That's right. Yeah.
So we share it around, so everyone feels a buy-in.
Yeah.
Same with the Small Island States Association globally, or the group that works with the European Union, the African, Caribbean, Pacific. They circulate that power. So that's an important symbol of respect, I think. Yeah. And so the hard part now is to find out who has the convening power and the mediating power to work with to resolve this problem. That's right. Is it Fiji? Yeah. Fiji's having its own problems with the University of South Pacific, so its relationships aren't strong at the moment to be respected to lead this situation.
As it happened before. Yeah, we like
Fiji before was quite strong on being that mediator.
And during the time of Ratu Mara in
70s and 80s, he did resolve.
And them.
They resolved these tensions because they knew
very hard now to find leaders of that caliber.
That's right.
Yeah, and that charismatic.
And they also knew each other, and they also had the power in their own society. That's a traditional authority. So Ratamara.
Now there is also another problem of internal local power and how they maneuver and interact with their own people. So if it's another issue.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can't spend time at the regional level because you're looking at your back, or wondering what's happening back in the capital. And,
so it seems that democracy, islanders can't really cope with the concept of democracy. They need to take both sides of their traditional ways of doing things and also the democratic principles.
I think
to balance out things.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case the traditional side. I think the two key leaders that emerged were the Prime Minister of Samoa and the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea. They both put forward very sensible.
You're talking about now,
right now.
Yeah, that's right.
They put out very sensible ideas about how to resolve this conflict.
Beautiful.
In the Pacific way.
Yeah.
And so you had the oldest leader of Polynesia and the leader of the biggest state in Melanesia, both saying we need to embrace Micronesia in the Pacific way. We need to be open to the system that will suit them in terms of this voting system, and
to make sure one won't underestimates the other, and vice versa. The balance must be there.
The balance,
the Pacific way and also the regional and the global ways.
Yes,
because my understanding, you may correct me, that when we push one side, it can cause further problems and new problems. And if you on the other side only with its great emphasis, then the other side is suffered, like what we have seen throughout the years. But I think with your New Pacific policy and what you have been doing, particularly from the ANU and other universities and your work, they help to a great extent and very much appreciated.
But I think
from the law.
So your point is interesting, though. To what extent do we talk about traditional principles, and to what extent we talk about modern democratic principles or other principles in resolving some of these things or making decisions? So, for example, I think for a lot of Pacific Islanders, they would still stand back and wait to find who has the right, who has the authority to actually hold the meeting, even to talk about these things.
Yeah.
So for outsiders, they don't understand that. They think, why don't they just go and fix it?
Yeah.
But they don't realise there's a process before the diplomacy to work out who has the right to do it.
Yeah.
So I think those local principles are still there in the Pacific, and they work very well because when they put into place, they take time, but in the end they do resolve the problem.
Yeah.
And if they didn't take the time, they wouldn't be able to resolve it because the wrong person would have initiated it and so on. And I think we notice it also in relation to the way people do consensus.
That's right.
At the Pacific Islands Forum,
Yeah.
Australia and New Zealand think that we're all doing the same consensus.
Yes.
But for an Australian chair of a meeting, they think there's consensus if they say, does everyone agree? And everyone's quiet. They say, okay, everyone agrees. So no one is against it. We have consensus. Whereas for a Pacific chair, they realise the body language is wrong.
Yeah.
They realise that we need more time.
Yeah. Sometimes you're quiet because you don't agree.
Yeah. So it's that reading of the room. So that's where the traditional principles are still important in understanding the cultural principles of diplomacy that are enacted all the time in that regional domain.
Yeah.
And Australia and New Zealand don't often understand that.
Yeah.
And so they make mistakes, I think, because of that.
That's right, Greg, I think we come to the end of this very productive, positive and enlightening talk. I think you have covered a lot of very fundamental issues, and it's a blessing for us, blessing for me and Noah and also our audience. We're going to learn from these 2 episodes. We're going to use them for our courses, and all I want now, I have nothing to ask, nothing to comment. I'd just like to pass on back to you if you want to say something to finish up with our talk, and then we close the show.
I think that the main message I would have is that from my work is that when the Pacific is well led and people put the effort in to use those Pacific principles in creating cohesion, they're a powerful force in the world for protecting the livelihoods of Pacific peoples.
That's right.
But thank you very much, Siwa Malobito, for having me.
Thank you, Greg. That's Professor Greg Fry from the Australian National University. Greg, I don't know what else to say, but I'm so glad. And Fia in Tongan, Kawelangi, reach the sky for what you have shared, your time. I'm aware of your busy schedule, but to be here for these 3 different episode programs, it's a blessing, and I hope more good work for you, as they say. The reward for hard work is I think it's a biblical saying, to give you more work, for humanity. But malo with the Greg, and look forward to talking to you. We might ask you again, I don't know, on other issues with the Pacific or your area of study and the ANU. And I hope, Greg, that we will continue with some of your colleagues here at the ANU in this particular program, and also from the Pacific to share with our Lo'au and followers and movement, and also the world, your point of view and how you analyze and interpret things in the Pacific. Malo Abito.